Over the course of my many games in Risk of Rain 2, I have found that there are certain items that are completely busted in this game. However, these items require some conditions to be met before they're actually the nutty, insane items that they are. Today, I'm going to be listing 10 items in Risk of Rain 2 that are absolutely crazy, but only in certain conditions. And I'll be showing you the conditions as well, don't worry. And as always, remember to
smashing the like button for the YouTube algorithm.
Alright, item number 1, we'll be going hard at this one. Bustling Fungus. Anyone who's ever played Risk of Rain 2 before has probably ran into Bungus. This is an item that requires you to stand still for it to even work. Needless to say, in a game like Risk of Rain 2, where you're forced to move so you don't get hit by things that will instantly kill you, you don't want to be standing still. Also, with only 1 or 2 stacks, you're not really healing that much of your HP, so standing still will probably lose you more health than it will gain you. Add on to the fact there are several survivors in the game with abilities that knock them back, which means that they're not going to be able to use the Bustling Fungus. And also there are certain enemies that will knock you back, think Lesser Wisps, which are very numerous. So really, there's about 0 situations where you're ever going to be able to stand still and gain back HP with Bustling Fungus. Enter the Engineer, the character in the game that has 2 turrets that copy his items and can stand still. Now right now I'm only talking about his stationary turrets that literally don't have the ability to move, so regardless of what happens to them, they will always be standing still and creating a Bustling Fungus AoE. And also, because the Engineer copies items and he has 2 turrets, that means he can have double the effectiveness of a single Bustling Fungus. Whereas a regular survivor, let's say Commando, stands still for 2 seconds, they will create a zone for 4.5%. With the Engineer, he can overlap it in the perfect Venn diagram and have a zone which in the center will create a 9.5% healing per second AoE. Pretty nice, yes. And of course, we can add the Engineer. If he also stands still, you'll also get that AoE. So in other words, if you're Engineer, the Bustling Fungus might be one of the strongest items in the game, but if you're not, well, there's a scrapper on some levels. Alright, now for number dos. Brainstalks. Brainstalks is a red item, aka a legendary item, which upon killing an elite monster, enter a frenzy for 4 seconds, where skills have 0.5 second cooldowns. Now, the 0.5 second cooldown is the global cooldown, so essentially Brainstalks is like having no cooldown on your skills, because that's the lowest that it can go. Now, most people hate seeing a Brainstalks. That's because you need to kill an elite monster and you don't even get 100% cooldown reduction. There are just some survivors out there that even with like 0.5 seconds on their abilities, they're not going to be that strong. I mean, let's use Engineer as an example. So what? He can place his turrets down a lot, he can only have 2 max down, and also with his mines, he can only have a certain amount of mines down at the same time. And also Loader can only charge her fist depending on which fist she has, so that means that she won't even be able to utilize the fact that it's a 0.5 second cooldown because her charge gauntlet requires her to charge it for several seconds. Multi is the same way. What are multi skills gonna do? Literally nothing. In fact, I would say just about all of the strong survivors in the game don't really like Brainstalks. However, the caveat being, basically every single weak survivor can be strengthened by using Brainstalks. It's a weird phenomena that I've seen occur, but every time I think a survivor is complete dog at the game, I pick up a Brainstalks and for some reason they're just insane. Let's use Commando for example. You get Commando, you get Brainstalks. You can now use your Suppressive Fire almost the entire time. It feels like there is literally no cooldown on it because you're shooting during the entire 0.5 seconds cooling down. It's like a non-stop minigun. Or even think of Mercenary. If you have a Brainstalks on him, kill an elite enemy, you now have Eviscerate on a 0.5 second cooldown, which means you basically are invulnerable to damage. This is because your Eviscerate gives you iframes and, you know, there's no cooldown on the ability with Brainstalks. There was a video I had called Eclipse, but we looped twice. In that video, I got a Brainstalks on Mercenary. It wasn't Eviscerate, it was the alternate special, but still, it was crazy. He did so much more damage than I could have ever expected. So in other words, if you are Commando, Mercenary, or some other kind of crappy survivor, the Executioner from Starstorm 2 by the way, Brainstalks will make you so much better. But if you're already good, you're probably not going to benefit too much from it. So, you know, rip. Number trace, Rose Buckler. The Rose Buckler is a pretty good item, I wouldn't lie. Increases your armor by 30 while sprinting. Now, armor isn't necessarily intuitive, so you probably have no idea what 30 armor means, but it's roughly like 20% damage reduction, I believe. So that means anytime you're sprinting and you get hit by something, you take 20% less damage from it. Pretty cool, but you're most of the time going to be shooting and not sprinting. So any type of character that cannot sprint and shoot is not going to be utilizing the Rose Buckler to its maximum potential. Enter Agile Survivors. There are some survivors in Risk of Rain 2 that have the Agile thing. This makes it so that they can actually shoot / swing their sword / do whatever the hell they're using and also sprint at the same time. Examples include Mercenary, Huntress, and Acrid if he's using his secondary skill. This means they can pump out DPS while also having a constant 20% damage reduction at the same time. That's actually pretty crazy. So if you are a sprinting / agile survivor, picking up a couple of Rose Bucklers, pretty good. If you want to see an example of it, in which we made a video about it, I have a video called I Can't Take Damage. I played multi, I had a bunch of Rose Bucklers, and I literally couldn't take damage. So that's a perfect example of how this item could be completely crazy. All right, next up we have number 4, Death Mark. Now, Death Mark is basically a toilet where I always spew my shit on it. The reason for this is because Death Mark is an item that not only requires you to have other items, but it also doesn't allow you to do anything with it unless you get those items. So the Death Mark's effect is enemies with 4 or more debuffs are marked for death, increasing damage taken by 50% from all sources for 7 seconds. This means that if you get a single Death Mark, you now need to figure out where you're going to get 4 debuffs. For most survivors, actually yeah, I think most survivors, they have 0 debuffs in their kit. If you get this on stage 1, you are on the lookout for 4 items which will allow you to get debuffs. And that's just for the item to be active. There are some runs where you might not ever get the Death Mark active. However, there are a few survivors in the game which have a plethora of debuffs. The one we're going to be talking about is Rex because he has 2 debuffs, which means you have to only get 50% of the required items for debuff or Death Mark to be active. Rex has his Weakens, which counts as 1 debuff, and also his special ability, which counts as a 2nd debuff. That means he only has to get a Gasoline, a Tri-Tip Dagger, or, any of the other 2 items out there that will allow him to get more debuffs. Once you finally get the Death Mark to be active, you will see how strong it really is, but until then, it's kind of a bad item. So if you're not Rex or Acrid, 2 people that start with actual debuffs in their kit, you're probably not going to be picking up the Death Mark and thinking, ooh, yay. Number 5, Crowbar. Now, to be honest, the Crowbar isn't really that great of an item on itself. You deal 150% damage plus 50% per stack damage to enemies above 90% health. So basically, 1 stack gives you triple a Death Mark damage boost to enemies above 90% HP. And then every subsequent stack gives you 50% on top of that. The stats sound good, but it only works against enemies that are above 90% HP, which shouldn't be a lot considering you're always going to be shooting things. And of course, because you'll get AoE items later in the game, or you might be an AoE survivor, you're probably going to be putting everything below 90% HP almost as soon as they appear. Now, I know I've been talking about survivors mainly as the conditions that require these items to be really good. However, the Crowbar is one of the items I think is really good with other items, depending on which items you get. Now, the Crowbar is also really good with certain survivors. For example, if you had Artificer, a very high burst DPS survivor, Rex, a high burst DPS survivor, and also Loader, a high burst DPS survivor. They all have skills that do lots of damage, so adding 150% on top of that initially would be extremely powerful. I mean, just take a look at Loader's Charged Fist. If you can get 2,000 damage, multiply that by 150% damage, and you've got a lot of damage. But there are other items in the game which also have damage multipliers. One such item, Renaud's Band, does 250% damage if you are above the 400% damage threshold, which means it pairs very nicely with high burst DPS survivors. So now let's take that Charged Fist example I already said. 2,000% damage times 250% damage times 150% damage. That's a lot of multiplying, and that's also a lot of damage. Once I get certain items in the game, for example Renaud's Band or Ceremonial Daggers, I start prioritizing Crowbars over other items because they add so much damage. Crowbar kinda sucks on its own, but once you get certain items and even certain survivors, it will actually do quite a bit of damage. Number 6. Focus Crystal. Another item, much like Crowbar, that requires certain rules to be in place before it actually activates. For Focus Crystal, it increases damage to enemies within 13 meters by 15% plus 15% per stack, but you have to be within 13 meters. Now this sounds like a big deal on paper. You have to be in almost melee range, actually I think it's essentially melee range, to do the extra bonus damage. So to most people, this means that you're going to have to be a melee survivor. And yeah, that's kind of basically it. Most other survivors like to keep their distance because being in 13 meter range of certain enemies, I'm talking about Elder Lemurians with the overloading trait, will probably kill you. Or take it a step further, being 13 meters within Mithrix? Yeah, not signing up for that anytime soon. So Focus Crystal is only gonna be good if you're forced into melee range, aka you're a melee survivor. There are only really 2 survivors that are forced, quote, into melee range. This is Mercenary and Loader. Akrid might be a melee survivor, but he's not forced into melee range. He could just use his secondary ability or his special ability and never have to go into melee range. Whereas Loader and Mercenary, if they want to do damage, you better believe they gotta go into melee range. But that's not necessarily a bad thing when you're able to do 15% extra damage on every single hit you do. And this applies to other items as well. If you have other items that do more damage, then you will be doing 15% more damage with those other items. If you had an ATG and it procs on the thing that you are hitting within 13 meters of you, then the ATG will do 15% extra damage. If you have a Crowbar and the enemy is above 90% HP, that 150% does now 15% more extra damage. And of course, Focus Crystal stacks linearly, which means if you get 2, you get 30%, 3, 45%, and 5, 60%. So for every Focus Crystal, you're getting 15% extra damage. And since it's a common item, aka literally not very hard to get, you're going to be able to get a lot of these. So if you're a melee survivor, Mercenary, Loader, then please pick up Focus Crystals because they'll do a lot of damage. Number 7, Happiest Mask. Now the Happiest Mask is not really that good. I'll be honest with you, even in its best case scenario, it's still kinda iffy. The main reason for that being is that there are certain enemies, for example the Void Reaver or the Clay Dune Strider, which once they get low enough, or in the case of the Void Reaver die again, they actually can kill you. Even though they're technically on your side, they're your friendly AI, they can still kill you. That being said, there is one scenario where I think the Happiest Mask is pretty decent. This is once you get enough 57 leaf clovers, or just, maybe get super lucky in the Mithrix fight, you can actually summon Lunar Chimera to hit Mithrix. Now, I'm really grasping for straws here on use cases for the Happiest Mask, but there has been a time where in the last phase of Mithrix, I had a Lunar Chimera actually shoot and kill Mithrix without me having to do anything. This is because the Happiest Mask's 1500% damage was actually pretty good with its heat-seeking tracking ball. Now in the examples that I'm showing you, they all do terrible. In fact, I think that the Lunar Chimera don't really scale that well, but Mithrix scales insanely well. So honestly, if you don't get this strategy within the first loop, it probably won't happen. It probably isn't going to make that big of a difference. Probably wouldn't do it anyway, but this is okay use case, alright? It's pretty decent, and stage 4 is a bitch, so I'll put this here anyway. Okay, number 8, the Purity. No, I hate the Purity. Not really. I kind of made a video about the Purity, which goes over a couple of use cases of the Purity. I think it's literally titled something like, is the Purity good on any survivor? Oh yeah, that's what it's called. In it, we find out that there are some survivors that it's pretty good on, but also most of them are pretty bad with it. This is because the Purity's effect is -2 second cooldown, but also -1 luck. Luck being the thing that determines the chance of items proccing, or, their effect being used. Just one Purity can make it so your ATG, which has a 10% chance, have only a 1% chance. That's a pretty big downgrade, and ATG is one of my favorite items, so yeah, F the Purity. However, there are certain survivors that can absolutely wreck with the Purity. And of course, if you don't have any proc items on you, or items that won't really be affected by the negative luck, then the Purity is pretty good, there's no downside. Or alternatively, you have a 57 leaf clover, which will negate the effect of the minus luck from Purity. Most people, at least when I say that the Purity is bad, will mention how good the mercenary is with Purity, because if you get enough, he's literally invulnerable. Well, let's look at his Eviscerate. It has a 6 second cooldown, that means one stack will give you 4 second cooldown on Eviscerate. The Eviscerate lasts for 1.3 seconds, so basically you're invulnerable for 1.3 seconds, you have a 4 second cooldown, that means, actually hold up, you actually have a 0.6 second invincible after the Eviscerate ends, so add that on, and you have about 2.1 seconds where you're not invulnerable with Eviscerate, and that's with one single Purity. This means that you're going to need 2 more, because every subsequent Purity means you have to have -1 second instead of -2 for the first stack, which then equals -3 luck. Now that is absolutely bad, but keep in mind that if you max out certain things, for example, you can max out crit, have a 100% crit, and then Purity can't affect it. Also, Tri-Tip Dagger is the same way. If you have a maxed out Tri-Tip Dagger, you cannot get it reduced by Purity. You might not be able to ever proc your ATG ever again. It might literally be at 0.00002%, but still, you're probably going to be able to kill things with max out crit and bleed. Very stringent conditions, but pretty good nonetheless. It will make your run almost easy mode if you're basically invulnerable. Just, get some carpal tunnel juice and slather it on your hand. Alright, we're winding down. Now, on to number 9, the Crowdfunder. A very misunderstood item, which really doesn't get a fair shake of things. It has a bunch of damage built in with a 1.0 proc coefficient, I believe, which is absolutely crazy for an equipment. It might actually be one of the strongest equipment in the game. The main problem being is that, much like a lunar equipment, it actually costs you to pick it up. You see, every single bullet that the Crowdfunder shoots costs you 1 gold. It scales with time, but just let's, for the simplicity of it, say 1 gold. It also increases its fire rate the more it shoots, and at maximum spin, it will fire 15 shots per second. So basically, per second, you're losing 15 gold. That's a lot of gold to be losing. That being said, there is a way to negate the gold that you lose from the Crowdfunder. You can actually pick up brittle crowns, which allow you to get gold every time you hit an enemy. Actually, it's more like a 30% chance, I believe, but you get the idea. There is a 30% chance on hit to gain 2 gold that also scales over time with the Crowdfunder. If you get 2 brittle crowns, you can make the Crowdfunder self-sustaining. Now, this isn't perfect. For example, you can actually only have 1 brittle crown and keep it self-sustaining as long as you're also shooting enemies with your other abilities. That's pretty freaking cool. Also, if you're playing with the Artifact of Sacrifice, I think it is, which allows the enemies to drop items rather than chests, I think if you pick up a Crowdfunder, there's no negative to it. I don't think it loses you gold if you use it. It's really weird. But in that scenario, having a Crowdfunder is probably the best equipment you can have, literally over every other equipment, just because it does so much damage. 15 shots per second. Let's do the math here, boys and girls. 15 shots per second at a 1.0 proc coefficient with 100% damage per bullet means it does 1500% damage per second, assuming you hit every shot. If you have other proc items, it's going to be doing a lot more damage than that because it's going to be proccing the whole time as well. So this is an absolutely cracked item if you meet the conditions there. You need brittle crowns, you need to not get hit, or else you'll lose all your money and you won't be able to increase your actual strength. It will actually gimp you. But if you do get the brittle crowns or you're playing sacrifice, oh my god, Crowdfunder OP. Please nerf. Alright, final on the list, number 10. This one is a personal favorite. I love it. I always meet the conditions for it. Number 10, Spinel Tonic. Now the Spinel Tonic is literally a lunar item. Unlike every other item on this list, it actually has a negative effect on purpose. It gives you a massive boost to all stats with a chance to gain an affliction that reduces all stats. i.e., you'll get like 100% damage increase, a 70% attack speed increase, but if the tonic wears off, you have a 20% chance to gain a tonic affliction, reducing all your stats by -5%. So damage -5%, attack speed -5%, movement speed -5%, IQ -5%. Thank God it's only percent based, so the smaller it is, the less you lose. This is also affected by luck, by the way, so this means that if you have a 57-leaf clover, you only get a 4% chance to get the affliction, but with a purity, you get a 36% chance to get an affliction. So with purity, this is a no-no. With clover, this is a go-go. Alright, so what are the exact conditions you need for Spinel Tonic to be completely crazy? Also, I'll say Spinel too. Here we go, Spinel. For anyone who's gonna correct me down there, it could be Spinel, it could be Spinel, I don't fucking know. But if we want the tonic to be absolutely cracked, what do we need to do? Alright, so the secret to this item is that if you are actually on the tonic, if it has 0% downtime, you will not gain an affliction. So as long as you're keeping on the sauce the entire time, there's no way for the game to get you an affliction. The reason this works is because you only get the chance for a tonic affliction after it wears off. So if for any reason you were on the tonic affliction and you were managing to keep it to 0% cooldown for a large portion of the stage, but then all of a sudden at the very end of the stage you wore off, you might get 3 to 4 afflictions depending on how long, or how unlucky you are. However, if you managed to keep it 0 cooldown, you never got off the sauce, and you went to the next stage and then it wore off there, you would get 0 afflictions. Because if you go to the next stage, it basically clears it for that stage. Pretty cool affliction. It's really nice to have that when you're always on the sauce. So how are we going to get to 0 cooldown? There are 2 ways. You can either have 4 gestures or 7 fuel cells. Or, and this is a trick someone taught me from Twitch chat, that if you have a gesture and a fuel cell and both of them equal 4 total, I think. So if you have 1 gesture and 3 fuel cells, that's 0 CD. Or 100% uptime. Let's just talk about uptime. Let's say 100% uptime. Or if you had 3 gestures and 1 fuel cell, that's 100% uptime. Or 2 gestures and 2 fuel cells, that's 100% uptime. As long as you have a total of 4 combined, then you're good. This doesn't mean that you can have 4 fuel cells and be good. That won't work, I don't think. You actually need 7 fuel cells if you don't have a Gesture of the Drowned, because the Gesture of the Drowned reduces it by 50% on its first stack. So the most cost-effective way to do it is to get at least 1 gesture. Past that, the gestures give you as much CD as a fuel cell, so just get the fuel cells. Capiche? Capiche. If you manage to get your 100% uptime on the Spinel Tonic, it is absolutely the best item in the game. There is literally no item in the game that will probably do more damage than this. I swear. It will turn every run that you think is completely dead and gone to the best run of your life. Just make sure you got that 100% uptime or you will regret it very woefully. Anyway, that's it. That was number 10. That was the final one. There is no number 11. If you have any more that you would like to add, throw them down in the comments. It's always interesting to hear some garbage items that could be really good with certain conditions. Those are cool builds. Anyway, like the video or something, and subscribe too. Yeah. Bye.